Reverend Dr. P. Marandi, Moderator, Church of North India, Right Reverend Ashok Vishwas, Honorable Rector and Secretary Dr. Abraham, Vice Principal Professor Arpita Mukherjee, most respected members among the audience, and I see quite a lot of them, and my friends. I never expected any crowd today morning. After the football match at night, I thought I would have the pleasure of addressing an empty hall. And therefore, you can pardon me if I stutter. The purpose of this short, I try to make it short at least. The short delivery is to position the role of Dr. Alexander Duff. You see, when we talk about great men in the past, Carey, Marshman, Ward, when you talk of Dr. Adams, Macaulay, Alexander Duff, they're all squeezed into one box. And we tend to think of them in one slot, if at all we know the subject. If we are not very familiar with the subject, we tend to put them all in one stream as persons who had come with a mission and persons who must have done something for education in India. Segregating the roles and placing them in a historical sequence is an essential task for us, at least on auspicious days like this, when you celebrate the 185th anniversary of Foundation Day. I would try to make a position and give my interpretation of where Dr. Alexander Duff stands. In his preface to George Smith's The Life of Alexander Duff, it's a book worth reading, that was published in 1879, many years ago. William Taylor had predicted that Alexander Duff would go down to posterity along with William Burns and David Livingstone. You have all heard of David Livingstone's work in Africa, as together constituting the three mighties of the noble band of Scottish worthies. They were all Scotsmen who had given lustre to the annals of our century. This was written nearly 150 years ago when Britannia ruled the waves. And it was a bounden duty of every missionary to save more and more souls. Little did Alexander Duff realize what his destiny was when he arrived in Kolkata on the 27th of May, 1830. After two unnerving shipwrecks, people who are familiar with his life would know the two shipwrecks he had had. Any superstitious person would have taken these as omens, especially in India, and returned home. But then India would have lost a great educationist. He began his mission in a manner in which only Alexander Duff would leave his stamp. He began his mission by circumventing the only order of the Scottish Church that had been given to him. So he starts with a holy defiance. And this is the most interesting part of the story. He circumvented the only order the Scottish Church of Scotland had enjoined, not to open a mission in Calcutta. Not to open a mission in Calcutta. Now let us see. The East India Company's ambivalence and often undisguised intolerance towards missionaries had already driven William Carey and J.C. Marshman to the protection of Serampore, which was a Dutch enclave. And even Bishop Middleton's venture was far outside Calcutta. Now you have to understand this context. Many people think that had it not been for the British East India Company, the British East India Company must have played a big role in the spreading of Christianity of either denomination. It was not so. The company was more against the missionaries. There were so many instances that not only was the company against it, even merchants, even indigo merchants and others who had, just 1 minute, this thing will go on like that. So even merchants who were up in the countryside were not well inclined. So these are facts we need to get clear. So they had been driven outside Calcutta, but at this time Kolkata was described in the 19th century as the metropolis of the British Empire. This was prior to the takeover of the empire by Queen Victoria. I'm talking of 1830s. That's at least 27, 28 years before. It was the jewel in the southern half of Asia, the greatest city of the English in the east. This is where young Alexander Duff decided to strike roots. And a similarity comes to my mind that when the apostles were moving around listlessly, wondering how to carry on the message of the original one and only Jesus Christ, the anointed one, Peter, had fallen on his knees, praying to God, where do I set up my church? Jesus had, at that, if you recall, had appointed Peter as the rock. Simon, thou art Petrus, the rock, upon which my church shall stand. But where would the church stand? Alexander Duff decided on the same theory that many other successful persons had done before him. Strike at the roots. Peter went to Rome, the city of the empire, the heartland of the empire, and Peter struck his roots and paid the price for it. He became a martyr there. Gautam Buddha also, after preaching around Sarnath and others, decided to go strike right into the heart of the Gangetic monarchy. Without coming to the heartland of the empire, your efforts are all in peripheral vain. Alexander Duff had this reckoning, and he decided in the same manner to build his church in Rome and nowhere other than Rome. Rome here is allegorical for the city of Calcutta. Duff took this major step when he decided to open a school. The second thing where he differed was to open a school for high caste Brahmins in July 1830. And this was the first one to teach English. Prior to him, all missionaries had concentrated on strata that were not completely integrated with mainstream or upper caste Hinduism, hoping that the lesser attraction or the frustrations may bear better results. But this is only one aspect of the story, and you will find Duff's mind traveling through this story. Whereas Alexander Duff was different, and within 1 year he set up, within 4 months of his arrival, he set up May, June, July, 2.5 months of his arrival, he set up the first school meant directly for the upper crust ruling classes of Bengal, Calcutta. And let's go through the reactions. Within 1 year, he had 300 pupils joining the school. 300 pupils joining the school. He had realized there was a gap, there was a thirst, there was a need for the upper echelons to also learn this new culture, this new religion, this new language, and open their doors. And therefore, the earlier attempts in the periphery of Bombay and Surat, in the periphery of Fort St. George, Madras, was not perhaps the right way. It was his satisfaction that 4 men of the highest caste took baptism, but that is his personal, personal gain. And they all became very important figures in the Indian church for years to come. I was browsing through the archival copies of the Calcutta Gazette, because that was only to do it outside of, in the periphery of Calcutta Gazette that was available, public records during this period, and found an interesting report. In fact, several interesting reports, and I leave them for you. Let us take a look at what contemporary newspapers had to report on the 4th of October 1830, July, August, September, October. This is what happens. The managers of the Anglo-Indian College, having heard that several of the students are in the habit of attending societies at which political and religious discussions are held, think it necessary to announce that strong disapprobation of this practice. He had lit the match, and there was no stopping. Think it necessary to announce a strong disapprobation of the practice, and they prohibit its continuance. Any student being present at such a society after the promulgation of this order will incur their serious displeasure. This is a single point I was making. That they were at what I would say, they had reached a state of critical maturity. And the only thing that was left was the key to the West, the key to Western education, for which all classes of Indians or at least those who were in close contact with the ruling powers knew. I have mentioned this in the context of how Enlightenment, English education, opening the Western doors, and a sense of self-pride, self-recognition in the sense of identity play a critical role within each other. That's the reason why I mentioned. I have also mentioned earlier the ambivalence or the antagonistic attitude of the company's servants, who were more interested in profits than in piety. They felt the missionaries were only trouble. They had this unwritten rule about not preaching amongst Orthodox Indians. The moot point I am stressing, ladies and gentlemen, is not about preaching. It is about the introduction of Western advances in the sciences and the arts. That is the key. It rides the surf of English education. And through the medium of a language which, though held still controversial, achieved the desired results in positioning India today where we are. This was the link the students of India would have to the best knowledge systems of other parts of the world. It will now be clear why this college was opposed with its students focusing on issues that could annoy the ruling establishment, because this was the second part of the Alexander Duff's strategy. He had made bridges with the establishment. He relation versus the establishment would not go on forever. And therefore, it was a part sense of, let me say, reconciliation. The Calcutta Gazette of October 30 replied, "The support and the countenance of the government have to a certain extent been given to this institution, and the managers may have felt that the state of things which arose and to which their order referred was such that in some degree not only may compromise their own responsibility, but the supposed preponderance of the higher authority." The sum in short is, we have written evidence to the fact that there was both the enlightenment coming in and a consciousness, and it was not one monolithic approach towards Christian teachings. But how did the upper echelons of Indian society react to these students, their sons, and Alexander Duff's school attracting so many students from communities that held the white man to be a mlecha, the impure foreigner? Let us look at that context. I hope nobody gets hurt with what I am saying, because I am referring to 150, 180 years ago, and we have to understand ourselves in the context. Here is an interesting report from the newspapers. The natives who have placed their children in the seminary have, we believe, done so on the bona fide stipulation that the courses of instruction were not to include anything that would in the slightest degree interfere with their own religious systems. This is one great thing that you notice in church education all over India. They have let the man take his call. We have one clear, consistent, imperative task before us: to teach the Hindu youth the elements of European knowledge and science, and nothing more. Now, no one will deny that this was gaining immense advantage. All at once, however, according to other sign, an alarm was spread. This was the same alarm that was spread in the case of De Rosio, it was spread in the case of all others. We know how very prominent a feature of the native character, is suspicion about natives being connected to some refinement of prejudicial concoctation. This is all old Enlightenment English, won't be able to make much sense. Matters in which they are perfectly distinct. One real reason for the Indians being so touchy, the Hindus being so touchy about these things, was not out of a sense that almost every religion has about its own state of affairs. Remember, Bengal at least, and many parts of India, had been placed under the rule of Islamic powers from 1202. That's for 600 to 700 years they were under Islamic powers that believed in a philosophy that was different to them. So there were certain motifs, certain do's and don'ts that would help them keep a distance and allow them to practice. And one of them was an utter oversensitivity to anything that might actually disrupt their way of life. Another report in the Calcutta Gazette mentions that the transparency of the first English missionary venture of consequence. The advocates of Christian predilections distinctly avow that they have no intention of attacking or reviling Hinduism. Therefore, the native parents and guardians are quite mistaken on that account. We intend, for we consider it our sacred and imperative duty, and it continues for the missionaries even now, to explain the evidences of our religion and let those who work to that effect and to take and are willing to hear us. That's all. They have never, and we will never exert undue authority. There were, however, difficulties. Such protestations will not work in a charged atmosphere where a single missionary stands among a few thousand other religions. However, in introducing modern medical practices, because this is one area, despite whatever Indians talk about Shushrut and others, there is no evidence of surgery being practiced and improved in India. And one of the remote reasons is the purity, impurity, pollution, touch, the dead body, the corpse, and other stigma attached to it. We had done well in physics, well in mathematics, well in what we call the pure subjects, where impurity and pollution would not come in. But when the human body was concerned, it was left only to medicine to cure itself, and an analysis of what was hot and what was cold. There were difficulties, and Orthodox Indians preferred to be examined either by Hakims if they were Muslims, or by the Vaidya caste if they were upper caste Hindu. They would rather go to an Ojha, who's not from the Vaidya caste, but not partake of anything else. This interesting report of August 1831 gives us a picture of the times. We observe by the native papers that a native medical society has been instituted. This has got nothing to do with Duff. Around the same time, in Calcutta, enlightened students had got together and set up a native medical society. The object of it appears to be a laudable one: the protection of the community insofar as it's within the power of the organization from quacks and ignorant pretenders. At least the first steps towards codification of knowledge, towards empirical codification, towards empiricism, towards the judgment between what is possible on a cause-effect relationship and what is quackery was established. And this was again the contribution of logic that came in from outside, from quacks. These quacks and pretenders have done incalculable mischief in Calcutta. This society, it would seem, composed of native doctors, properly so-called men of education and experience in native materia medica. And you can guess what it is. One caste, Vaidya. Aparichita, don't laugh. So, it's one single caste, Vaidya, who had practiced on the Ayurvedic and other forms of practice. The practice of physics are considered expedient to decline undertaking case. And there were others who would not partake of any medicine that did not come from these systems, not belonging, and this is the background in which Alexander Duff had to operate. His first attempts at medical education came up with a lot of resistance, but then, 20 years later, we succeeded in setting up the medical college, 25 years later. To understand Alexander Duff's strategy, let us look at what Michael Seward had to say on his three-pronged approach to education. Why is it that he succeeded? A, insisting on a high standard. Quality, quality, quality. Steve Jobs, quality, first quality. B, emphasizing on an international language. No compromise. C, on the methodology, method. Where the first was concerned, that is standard, Duff's first radical suggestion was to lay the foundation of a system of education which might ultimately embrace all branches ordinarily taught in the higher schools and colleges of Christian Europe. He said there is no compromise. Whatever is the contemporary state of the masters and postmasters in the colleges of Europe, be brought straight here. There is the wisdom, there is the receptacle that can take and understand. It's only a question of communication. This earlier belittling of the Indian mind that they would not be able to digest, not be able to absorb, was completely not present in Duff's mind, And that is why he concentrated on what we call the upper educated, the upper echelons, so that it gets quickly translated into reality. It was a controversial decision even by today's standards, but it was successful. Writing in March 1833 in the Calcutta Christian Observer, this was a journal periodical that he himself edited, Dr. Duff advocated both a higher and lower education. He says, quote, God has frequently smiled on the diligent, prayerful training of the young. Let therefore children receive the rudiments and youth the higher principles of useful instruction, in the way which experience may prove best adapted to secure the best desired results. In his book, India and the Indian Missions, published in 1839, he compared widespread primary education for the many. Do we give widespread primary education for the many with advanced higher education for the few? This contradiction continues in Indian education till today. The pull between mass education and elite education continues till today. It grips India without resolution, even as I am talking to you. And decided he was an advocate of the long term, the latter would be more effective. He said, let me first put in education right at the top, and there will be a roll down effect. As regards the former, he reminded his readers that generally nothing at all beyond the artificial and mechanical parts of acquisition were gained. Such methods were very inadequate. Indians had the system of learning by rote, by memorization, and he found that memorization of even whatever was taught in a different language would not help if it was not digested, if it was not acted upon, if it was not transmitted further. His target was very clear. We see the man coming out defying his church, setting it up in Calcutta. We see the man breaking tradition and joining hands to some extent, making peace with the powers. We see the man very clear about what is his target. We see the man very clear about what is his standard. Absolute clarity of view. To summarize his position, he pointed that in the present condition of the people of India, one central seminary of higher grade with its attendant retinue of preparatory gymnasia would do more towards vitally impressing the intellect and the heart of the people than any number of elementary schools. Of course, that's too much radical a view, but let it pass. He got his desired result. Any number of elementary schools, however much we indefinitely multiply them. Now let us remember, on the second strategy, the language, we may recall that Indians at higher levels were being taught in Persian, and official support was given to this language. Now I am talking to you about 1830. Look at 1930. Tagore was still wearing the dora, dastar, and the Bankim Chandra was carrying the hat, the dastar hat. Raja Ram Mohan Roy had that hat. The dress, the Persian dress was still being carried around. The jubba, as we called it, the jubba. So 100 years later also, the Persian influence of 600 years did not leave. The finest of men who talked to the English in English and died there, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, was not wearing a Western costume. He was wearing the costume, the jubba and the dora of Persia. The Persian vakil, educated pleader. So this was his target. And in addition, the study of Arabic and Sanskrit were also encouraged. His main contention was against Persian school of education. Persian and the Arabic was also encouraged, and a large number of books were officially published. In point of fact, government was slow to realize that the Indian intelligentsia wanted to learn English, and this is rapidly illustrated by the rapid speed with which English books were sold in Calcutta. The first man to realize this in the heart of Calcutta, who did not go away to Serampur and other places. But as we have seen, official policy was that the Oriental languages should be useful in education. We do not want to rock the boat. We do not want to rock the boat. Let it be taught in Persian, let it be taught in Arabic, let it be taught in Sanskrit. Our business is to settle here. But as we have seen the official policy, now this was a period, and let us say we have transported ourselves back to the period when his antagonism, his target was not with core Hinduism or core of Islam. It was with the language of instruction. I wonder what would have happened if we were still talking in Persian, if he had lost the battle. Duff at once realized the folly of this government dithering. Government was still dithering. Bentinck being one of the greatest reformative rulers that we had, was still every ruler has, every person of the ruling establishment has to take very careful considerations before judge. But he was a single man army. And from the start taught in English. He, however, insisted that all his pupils, this is a very little known fact, should be able to read and write in their own language, Bangla. You see, we lose this thing later on as we move along in an overemphasis on English to the cost of our mother tongue. But Duff would ask them, do you know your mother tongue? You must know your mother tongue. So these are misconceptions that we need to get off. And for this, the official language of education, he felt English was essential. In this, he was supported by Charles Trevelyan, by Lord Macaulay, and eventually the Governor General himself, Lord Bentinck. Men such as these felt that the budding Indian Renaissance that was about to bloom must be grounded in a language that could boast of a great literature and a linkage with the rest of the world, not one that was grounded to the soil of only India. As a missionary, Alexander Duff never hid the fact that he hoped that English would open the doors of the whole of Western culture and its underlying Christian ethos. There was no harm in him asking for this. For the next 5 years, the battle raged in India between the Orientalists and the Anglicists. This is the most exciting period in our education. And in 1835, Lord Bentinck announced the official policy on the basis of Macaulay's Minute on Education. The English Education Act was passed in 1835, and state patronage was completely shifted from Arabic, Persian and Sanskrit to English. This has been a very, very controversial step. We shall not go back and revisit a controversy of 1835 in the year 2015 or 2014. We need to find out what the after effects were. We need to find out. There are controversies on either way. This is the time where William Adams was put in to go and survey the villages. He did 1,35,000 villages of Bengal and then moved on to Bihar. How was the system of education affecting the students? Now, between this, there was this Council of Public Instruction, which would later on become the Directorate of Public Instruction, DPI, English Education. Where the third strategy was concerned, the method of education, Duff's plan was simple enough. He planned to give good education in secular subjects, but to use his biographer's word, were inseparable combination with the European ethics, the Christian faith and religion, and not merely on the foundation stone upon the superstructure, but how animating spirit would pervade and hallow all that was taught. His plan was received with immediate disapproval by both the British and in India and in England. So nothing doing. Don't overstep your boundaries. His first students were suspicious that the readings of the Christian scriptures might automatically make them Christians. But long before these difficulties were overcome, and this method of instruction was ultimately accepted by the famous Hindu families. This is where this. But Duff still had to convince the Christian public of both India and Britain that this was a right policy. The man had to struggle all through and went back fed up for the first time after 4 years. I don't know if you know that. He didn't ultimately. I just left one paper behind. Just give me the paper. No, I found it. My mistake. I found it. I've got it. convinced. So I have gone over the entire controversy without hiding facts to explain to you that every founder, every pioneer has to go through, and there is no point in hiding away, running away from history. These are the facts. He went in for a high standard, he went in for a high target, he went in for high quality, he went in far ahead before Macaulay and others even came up. My position is that Carey Marshman Ward of Serampura, one school, even Bishop Middleton, another school. Macaulay and the official language people would, Trevelyan, Macaulay and others would form what is called the Victoria School. In between lay the pioneer, the man who decided to jump on his own, a man who decided to defy the own diktat of his own church, decided because he felt by instinct what he was doing is correct. We can have a lot of time to go into the history and the perspective, but there I have placed him between Carey and Marshman and before Macaulay. The man who tried and the man who actually proved through the laboratory experiment of this very institution that it was possible. It was possible. To understand a man with a mission is often a complex exercise, and his history bestows virtue only on the victors and the prevailing mindset of the times. History is kind to contemporary systems, thereby judging the past rather harshly with the values of the present. Aristotle, for instance, with all his logic and with all his scientific approach, still believed in slavery. So we now go back and condemn Aristotle as one who believed in slavery. There were many wise philosophers who believed in the suppression of the woman. Let us segregate that aspect which was a prisoner of his times to what else he gave to the world. Condemns the mindsets of earlier periods as archaic, imperial, or overzealous, or even retrograde. All of this condemnation is made with retrospective effect. Academic analysis, however, enjoins that this approach is antithetical to scientific analysis and stands in the way of full flowering of the human mind, so that much can be accomplished in the future. To dismiss Duff as a Christian missionary will thus be most unfair and totally myopic. After all, if Dr. Duff had not taken the first steps on his own to spread effectively English education and modern knowledge systems much before the ruling powers took it upon themselves, we will miss a vital link in the history of India's enlightenment. Let me conclude by saying what Dr. Alexander Duff believed was the purpose of his toil. Quote, "The grand object of education is that it ought constantly to avow the moral and the intellectual regeneration of the universal mind in the speediest and most effectual manner to reach and vitally impress the entire body of the people of Hindustan." Thank you very much. Thank you.